So far in this series, we've considered representation as a matter of essential patterns in experience, and that's Husserl, and also as the relation of objective thought to its referent, which was Frege, and then the role played in a computational system, which is Fodor. In this video, we'll consider whether representational content is determined by biological function. According to Ruth, Garrett, and Millikan, who developed this view, a common mistake in theories of representation is to focus on the input to the system. And here I'm shifting away from representational theories in general to focus on causal theories. According to the causal view, my representation is about a football because it's somehow caused by the football. There are two main problems with input in determining the content of representations. And that is, first, there are too many possible representations, and second, there is a difficulty in accounting for misrepresentation. First, there are too many possible representations. As the cartoon shows, there are many ways to interpret perceptual input. But interpretation isn't the only problem. For any set of sensory signals, there's a causal chain from the origin to my representation. Every point in the causal chain bears the same causal connection with my representation. So why am I representing the football and not my visual system? What's going on in my retina or anything else in between? Maybe the light reflectance properties. These are the questions. Why is it football then? That's the cause. There are also many causal relations that aren't representations. So a sunburn, for example, doesn't represent the sun, even though it's caused by the sun and sitting out too long without any sunscreen. We would need some non-arbitrary way to specify which causes under what conditions count as representations. Second, causal theories have difficulty with misrepresentation. If an object causes my representation, that's the object that I'm representing. So if I look over my shoulder and I think that's the football, but it's really the brain, is it the brain that I'm representing, or is it that I'm representing a football? What is it that counts as the cause of my representation? Is it the thing that is causing the representation to be active right now, or is it the thing that originally caused me to have a football representation? In other words, is it the cause of my current representation, which is the brain, that determines what content is being misrepresented, or is the cause of the representation I'm using, football, that is misrepresenting the object as a football? Millikan realized that a critical addition was needed to specify how representations function for the system itself. As in Fodor's computational theory, we need to look at how the system is using representations, but unlike the methodological solipsism of that theory, use determines content. Here's how. In addition to representation producers, which involve causal relations with the object represented, consumers use those representations to perform their functions. So the football is out in the world, generating various stimuli that my visual system processes so that if the football varies in various ways, then my visual system needs to vary according to the ways that it changes. So far, this is basic causal theory. Now here's the addition. For my visual system to be producing football representations, there has to be consumers of that information. Some other part of my representational system needs to use that visual representation in order to perform its function. For example, my motor system needs for my visual system to be representing where the football is and what its shape is in order for me to be able to catch it. Millikan explains the two conditions for representation in this way. First, unless the representation accords so, by a certain rule, with a represented, the consumer's normal use of or response to the representation will not be able to fulfill all of the consumer's proper functions in so responding, not at least in accordance with a normal explanation. And here are two important special terms that Millikan uses. A normal explanation tells how a function was performed in a way that leads to its continued reproduction. And proper functions are those that figure in normal explanations. So you have in the theory, in the conditions for representation, a sense that there has been in the past a way that representation has functioned, a way that consumers have functioned, that have been successful, that have accounted for in a normal way why this representation got reproduced. Millikan adopts this special terminology in order to be super clear that not just any function will do, not just any explanation will do. The history of function is essential, as well as the conditions that account for successful performance of that function. And the second condition, in her words, is that represented conditions are conditions that vary depending on the form of the representation, in accordance with specifiable correspondence rules that give the semantics for the relevant system of representation. The second condition specifies that the way the representation functions for the system is by their correspondence to the object represented. My visual system represents the football by changing which neurons are activated based on which stimuli are generated by the football and its changes, according to a rule. So there are rules about how the changes in the football stimuli that are coming out will change my visual system, and that's the key relationship that determines that it's representing these features. But what makes it a football representation, or more generally a representation of this object, is that various representation consumers depend on the correspondence of the object and my visual system in order to perform their functions. So my motor system requires this correspondence in order to be able to catch it. My linguistic system needs the correspondence to hold in order to be able to talk about this object as I'm demonstrating it. My decision-making system needs the correspondence to hold in order to figure out whether I want to throw it or squeeze it or whatever else I want to do with it. So I need this representation. I need my visual system to accord with this appropriately so that all of these other systems can do whatever job they need to do in relation to this. Representational content, what the representation means, is specified by what object the representation covaries with. But that is determined by the covariation relations that the consumers need in order to fulfill their functions. So do my consumers need a football representation to do their job appropriately? Would a brain do just as well? It depends on what I'm doing, and that is why the consumers determine what covariation relation is key to forming the appropriate representation. In general, if my visual system didn't covary in relation to visual stimuli in the world, then my motor system wouldn't have been successful in getting me to good things and helping me to avoid bad things. And my other systems that rely on my visual system also wouldn't be able to do their job successfully. Finally, let's look at the two problems with causal theory and see how the consumer theory resolves them. First, there are too many representations. The problem here was to narrow down all of the various causal relations between my football and my football representation in order to determine which ones are the important ones or the relevant ones. On the consumer theory, my football representation covaries with the football because it's that representation that has gotten me to footballs in the past. And second, there's the difficulty of accounting for misrepresentation. And here the problem was to try to figure out whether I'm representing the brain mistakenly as the football or representing the football mistakenly as the brain. That is, what is the content of my representation? Its current cause or some other sort of content determining cause. On the consumer theory, when I think that my brain is a football, it's a misrepresentation because my football representation is triggered in the absence of a football. We can even say that I'm successfully representing this object because my visual system is still doing its functions in relation to varying according to the visual stimuli. But the application of my football representation to this object is a mistake because that football representation was successful in getting me to footballs, and this isn't a football. I like this theory very much. It connects the mind with the world while accommodating the different ways that each of us have to represent the world. So there will be shared ways we have of representing because there are shared uses that we have for things like footballs and things that have various shapes and colors. But there will be also unique ways that we have of representing. For example, only I can represent this as my football. But like all philosophical theories, there are drawbacks. One is the systemic nature of the consumer theory. Millikan applies this basic notion of representation to language, animal minds, concept formation, natural kinds. Her treatment of these topics interconnects and extends this notion of representation. I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time, and I know there's still a lot that I haven't figured out yet. Another more specific objection to the theory is its reliance on history and reproductive function, and this has been criticized as anti-materialist. Consider Swamp Man, a molecule-for-molecule duplicate of me. But Swamp Man resulted from a freak electrical storm. So Swamp Man has no history of representations having served any functions. If I were Swamp Man, I would not have a football representation because I've had no reason to get to footballs. But on a materialist view, representations are physical states and processes, and Swamp Man has exactly the same physical states and processes that normal human me has. So it seems like Swamp Man ought to have the same representations. Millikan accepts the counterintuitive consequence that Swamp Man has no representations, despite the fact that it's a duplicate of my physical system. Until Swamp Man uses its system as a representational system, it doesn't represent. Its processes are meaningless. So think about the role of history and function in determining representations. Is that the key feature? Or is Husserl right that patterns of experience are what determines what you represent? Are meanings abstract thoughts that refer to things, as Frege suggested? Or are they nodes in an internal causal system, as Fodor thought? When you have a thought or a perception about football, how does it come to be about the football? On the one hand, it seems obvious. We've been representing things for as long as we can remember. But when you come to try to think about what it is to have a representation, how the brain, or whatever it is, has come to have representations, it's not really obvious at all. In particular, and my main reason for producing this series, what is it for a machine to have representations? If the computational theory is right, then simply having the right internal causal relations is sufficient. If the consumer theory is right, the system also has to serve the function of representation. There needs to be a reason for the system to represent the football. I could certainly design a system that represents footballs. This video is representing this football, but the representations are not functions for the system. The video doesn't care that I'm representing the football or anything else. It'll represent whatever I want. I'm the one that it's serving the functions for. It doesn't have functions of its own. These two theories have very different consequences for how we evaluate artificial intelligence. Maybe AI is already capable of representation and therefore has a mind. Or maybe programming is insufficient to produce a mind in the absence of proper functions. For us, representations serve a biological function. They help us survive. Without biological needs, could there be artificial proper functions? Or is that a contradiction in terms? My bottom line is that this isn't obvious, and AI researchers and people who are promoting AI and even fear-mongering about the robot apocalypse have to address this question of what it is to be a mind. And if I'm right that being a mind is to be a representational system, then they need to think about what it is to represent and not just take that for granted. We use a word that's representation, we know what representation is, and every time we see it, we say that's a representation. But what is it to be a representation producing and consuming system? This is the question, and we need to think about that.